Okay, so here's the deal with today's story. I saw all of the headlines, likely just like you guys did, right? Naughty Dog's Neil Druckmann says that generative AI is going to herald in some sort of future. And then, of course, comments about the next game Naughty Dog are making and how it's basically going to redefine our expectations, right? Of what a game is going to be. Now, for a lot of people, kind of saw that and thought, right, you're doing all this talking about the generative AI, yet we know a lot of the testimony from people who worked at Naughty Dog in, say, fields like animation, who ended up feeling like they were overworked and burnt out. So there's a bit of suspicion there. Of course, the game itself, Last of Us Part 2, definitely a little bit more, slightly divided in opinions on that, which I think means that overall people are primed to see this and think, what the hell, Neil? So we dove deeper and things got more interesting. The overall situation here is Neil did some interview stuff. You're going to find out who, and the who really matters. As an example, in this tweet from Culture Crave, that kind of summarized things. It reads, Neil Druckmann says AI will reduce costs, revolutionize development, and help push the boundaries of storytelling in games. He adds there are ethical issues that need to be addressed, but it's crucial to precisely direct the tools to achieve the intended outcomes. So, a lot of these things kind of spread about the place. And where it's fascinating to me is the broad coalition. I love this tweet from Noodle. It's crazy that if you assembled a hypothetical gamer NATO, you could probably unite them all via their shared hatred of Neil Druckmann. The funny thing being, you have a lot of people who are still fairly upset over the direction things went with Last of Us Part 2 and general sort of fallout from that, but you also have then got people who make games who are deeply suspicious about the working conditions of that studio, who then see somebody who, in that interview, that quote, that did come off to be really arrogant. So you really do have, from the people who make games to a lot of customers, bit of an eyebrow raise, bit of a big sus, right? I mean, what he said understandably antagonized people, but there's a twist in the story. One, it's a twist that does not let him off the hook, but it makes things more complicated. So, in the way that we try to do here, let's dig into what Neil actually said, where he said it, who he said it to, who was asking the questions, and even what was the top-level domain under which that piece was sort of sent to print across the internet. Because it wasn't PlayStation.com. It was, in fact, Sony.com. It's a part of a series. You probably didn't know that, but yes, it's a part of an interview series. And when you look at the other interviews, oh boy, things get very clear. So, if you like the idea of us doing that sort of thing, taking a little bit more time in these stories, trying to really dive into what's actually up, the broader forces at play, and if you want to support what we do, you can head to Bellular.games. To be real with you, with how AdSense and that sort of thing is, frankly, if it was AdSense alone, we would not be able to kind of do the show, right? So, the good news is, though, that between the support of our members and some of the sponsors who support the show, we are able to do that. I'm trying to grow us to do better things, but also to do so sustainably. We have big plans. Suffice to say, everyone over at Bellular.games really does help. Now, in return, you guys get Loading Screen, which is our daily newsletter. There you will find out a lot about new games as they are releasing. You'll find out about a lot of other news stories. You'll get all of the reports, like, say, this very one that I'm talking about now. You'll get our report in that, like, days early before I even see it, right? A whole bunch of things. So, Bellular.games. Thanks to everybody there. And with that said, let's talk about what Neil said. So, the interview itself. Here's a question. How do you envision the future of storytelling and technology evolving over the next 10 years? And what Neil basically says is, more fidelity doesn't just mean more realism. He also says it means more opportunity for stylization. Now, non-technical people can basically create more easily because of advancements in tech. And then he says the really big thing, and of course for this, I can't paraphrase, I have to do the quote so you actually know the full thing, the literal words he said. AI is really going to revolutionize how content is being created, although it does bring up some ethical issues we need to address. With technologies like AI and the ability to do motion capture right from home, we're reducing both costs and technical hurdles, opening the door for us to take on more adventurous projects and push the boundaries of storytelling in games. So that's really our first big quote. What I want to do for today's piece, though, is actually we're going to walk through what Neil said together, and then we're going to take stock of things. So the next question put to him was, how will emerging technologies foster global collaboration and transmedia storytelling entertainment? And by the way, as you go through this, just think, This really is Sony asking the questions. I wonder if they have a horse in this race. So he talks about virtual sets and video game tech, meaning there's not as much of a need for a physical set. Again, virtual sets, think about how, say, 1899 was shot, how Mandalorian was shot. A lot of the Disney Plus shows, which I think eventually went so into the virtual sets that the limitations started to become a storytelling problem. Anyhow, he talks about global collaboration and real-time feedback, meaning that he could basically shoot stuff for The Last of Us Season 2 from LA while they are in Canada. And indeed, there is cool stuff there. Apple showed off some of that in their recent thing. I know even the people who make the very cameras we shoot these shows on, Blackmagic, they have some similar tech that is really impressive. So that stuff is pretty damn cool. Next question: what advice do you have for the next generation of creators? And he says, I emphasize mastering fundamentals over tools. With AI, your creativity sets the limits. Understanding art history, composition, and storytelling is essential for effective direction. Now, this is where it gets interesting to me. From the perspective of Druckmann, he is talking about direction as its own skill set for creators, but he then does drift a little bit into what he probably thought was meant to show technological progress, but to many it ended up coming across as an insult to both writers and animators. And this is what he said, quote, tools evolve quickly. Some tools, once essential, are now obsolete. At Naughty Dog, we transitioned from hand animating Jak and Daxter to using motion capture for Uncharted, significantly enhancing our storytelling. AI will allow us to create nuanced dialogues and characters, expanding creative possibilities. However, it's crucial to precisely direct these tools to achieve the intended outcomes. So I think that last line about the precisely directing, that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And what that reminds me of a little bit is whenever Andy Serkis, of course, played Gollum, played Caesar in the recent Apes movies. I think he's still working the Apes movies, and obviously as a motion capture performer, Andy Serkis is absolutely incredible, and I deeply respect and love a lot of what he has put out into the world. But at one point he did have this quote of how he sees the animation stuff as digital makeup for his performance. But of course, that's when it gets interesting, because really an animator will be animating Gollum, yes, quite inspired by what's going on with Andy's face, but there is a lot of craft to the animation. So a lot of animators heard that and kind of thought, oh, that's a little disappointing. And with this, I think you can see a similar thing. For a lot of people, they look at Jak and Daxter and they think, hey, those animations, like, man, that stuff is timeless. Whereas you might look at some mocap stuff in that maybe Last of Us Part 1, of course, back when it was just called Last of Us, in that era, and you maybe think, okay, I can see how this is impressive technically, but maybe there's a little less authorship. Maybe it's saying a little bit less. But again, this is Neil, who is very much into hyper realistic, character acting and that kind of thing. Now, for Naughty Dog, they weren't actually doing facial capture. I still believe that all of the facial work was hand animated. And if you actually listen to the behind the scenes feature that they did for The Last of Us Part 1, or just in general, animators saying that even if you have all of the data from a performer's face, well, when you're actually animating, you're going to have to ham up the right emotions. There is a real artistic craft in translating a performance from a human onto a model, even if you have got a whole bunch of, say, the tracking data from that human. Now, before we truly start to break this down, there is a really funny question. How can Sony advance interactive, immersive entertainment and storytelling with its diverse capabilities? Can you tell that this interviewer is somebody who works for Sony, and this is a Sony interview with one of their people to be posted on Sony.com? He breaks it into two things. Better hardware means more complexity, more fidelity, and then more sophisticated tools, which will increase efficiency. And he describes the latter there in terms of Naughty Dog's engine automating and environmental design stuff based on parameters, and how basically it would be useful if mocap didn't need markers and, set up in a similar way. Again, there's still quite a lot of physical work you've got to do when you're doing mocap, as opposed to a lot of those more automated, sort of basic tools to kind of give you a layer of proc gen for when you're doing, say, environmental work. So if you were to steelman the case, you would sort of say that, okay, maybe there's some sort of AI that means that we don't need to do that hand rotoscoping. That's a massive pain in the ass. Again, I always think about the people who had to hand rotoscope the lightsabers in the Anakin Obi-Wan duel in the third Star Wars prequel movie. Can you imagine rotoing all of that by hand? People had to do it. For many, that is where the AI is good. Of course, the problem is what you and I see. We see people using it with no tact, with no taste, and unfortunately, a massive grift. Look at Etsy. I challenge you, go to Etsy and look for, say, a puzzle or stickers, and instead of a really well-designed, no, it's just AI vomit. Let's move from that vomit to the thing that really offended people. Could you share a personal vision or dream project you hope to see realized in the future of entertainment? And this is where Neil says, and I quote, "I'm eager to see how this new game resonates, especially following the success of The Last of Us, as it could redefine mainstream perceptions of gaming." Now, this to many just feels like Neil Druckmann being hubristic, and I think that is something that people would be very critical of about him. And indeed, when you look at, say, a game like The Last of Us Part 2, there was, obviously quite a lot of drama in the run-up to that game's launch, and actually the launch of that game. And I think what ended up happening there is, because of the character and tone of some of the backlash to that game, there was, I think, almost a little bit of a rally around the flag effect in a lot of the media and that kind of thing. And that essentially meant that everybody, it felt like anyway in the press, was kind of like rallying to defend that game. Now, from my perspective, look, I am not angry that fundamentally Joel got whacked. I think that absolutely could have been a plot element in that game, and it could have went a hell of a lot better. But I think that basically meant that he almost felt like more of an enemy to a lot of people. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of people, because there was then a lot of defense. Even though, if you then track forward a little bit in time, you have outlets like the now defunct Waypoint that, as an example, they posted, like, it's a critical article. I think it does make for an interesting read, but it is basically one about how the cycle of violence narrative really doesn't land as well as Neil seems to think that it does, which is certainly where I would quite land in my critique of that game. Anyway, that is to say, it's been a bit of a messy situation. To sort of take stock here, these are, number one, leading questions. Every one of these questions is leading Neil to talk about virtual production, AI-accelerated production, increases in efficiency. These are the sorts of things that are designed to make Sony investors see, well, essentially a clear range of very helpful answers that are reflecting their interests. This is then all going to be edited by corporate PR, and of course that will be done to suit their advertorial purposes. And this is basically a piece of advertorial. Like, this is not a journalist going and talking to Neil. This is somebody at Sony organizing an interview with one of their people, basically so it can be a puff piece that will be investor facing, posted on Sony.com, basically meant to make potential Sony investors or the business community at large look at this and say, wow, Sony is becoming a leader. This is Neil. Look at this. He's embracing all of this future technology for his new game, but he's also shown that the IP that he's made and the likes of our virtual all those things. Look, they're making The Last of Us, the big HBO show that has been very successful. Investors, business community, happy, happy, happy. That's sort of what's going on here, and that's why you see so many of those buzzwords. So we got to talk about where this was set. Right, this is a trailer for Sony's Creative Entertainment Vision campaign. It is the sort of like big embarrassing thing. For the gaming audience, you may be aware of this from the very weird fake controller that they showed off in the footage of this like futuristic PlayStation controller. It was just really weird. But what this campaign was Sony showing investors that they had a plan for the next 10 years that encompasses all parts of their business. Sony, PlayStation, yes, but also Sony in technology, Sony in music, in Sony Studios, Sony Animation, all that stuff. Now, these interviews are basically puffing all of that up, this creative entertainment vision, and there's 3 interviews. Druckmann is number 2. When you look at, say, interview number 1 with this guy called Lucas Dong, he's a filmmaker, he actually made that video, and when you look through it, he's talking about, in his interview, he's talking about how the Sony Venice digital camera system is amazing for filmmaking. He's talking about the potential of virtual production, about transmedia. When we look at Assad, who is the 3rd person who was interviewed, the head of PlayStation Productions and head of product of PlayStation Studios, what's he talking about? Well, he says, in terms of gaming's future, I envision games becoming more personalized because of advances in technology and AI, enabling customized experiences for each player. Imagine your own digital Sony waifu that caters to your every need, all as a part of some form of subscription or game. Lovely. They talk about more things like, immersive narratives and graphics, IP adaptations is a key thing for growing audiences, mixed reality, stuff like theme parks, and the democratization of storytelling by using all of this tech across everywhere. And that's where the democratization thing is interesting. What did Unity do? Unity, the game engine, has led to so many amazing indie games, even a few AAAs, right? But at the start, the democratization of sort of game creation that was definitely helped by Unity. What did that lead to? Well, it led to, say, a lot of Steam Greenlight interesting stories. And with AI, you see similar, there's going to be grifty bollocks. Like, that's going to be the first thing to come out, will be the grifty bollocks, because if you want to use a new tool well, you probably have to invest time in getting it right, not just rushing straight to market with a rubbish product. Something I think Marquez would have something to say about when we think about two other AI products recently. Anyway, the point here is this is not a statement by Neil Druckmann, guy from the studio that made Uncharted or Jak and Daxter or The Last of Us 2. This is an interview with Neil Druckmann, potential draw for investors for advertorial purposes. That is why this has happened in this way. And basically, Neil represents the very most important assets for Sony. Somebody with multidisciplinary success, going beyond games into sorts of fields that investors might actually recognize. And I think that is the major thing. A little bit like, even to say stuff about, say, like my parents. They may be like, oh yeah, you do videos on the internet. But whenever I mentioned that I do a podcast with Matt over on our Warcraft channel, they were like, oh, you do a podcast? And it's because that's the sort of thing that they recognize, that they understand. And it's just like that with the investors. Even though they might be able to see a bunch of numbers of how large games is, when they start to see it succeed in the field that they recognize and probably disproportionately care about, that's when they start getting interesting about money. So you can basically see how this entire thing, this entire PR nightmare for Druckmann, that of course was, spurred on by his own words, how this actually happened. And I thought that was fascinating. Now, there is then the question of, well, how much of this is on him? How much of this is on Sony? When a bit of advertorial like this is done, it's not really about interviewing the person. It is about ticking off those check marks that are going to be important for generating with perhaps in, say, the business press, the sorts of headlines that they would want. So this did lead to one thing of Neil responding to the drama. So one of these things here is quoted, and he says, "This is not quite what I said, a short thread. In editing my rambling answers in my most recent interview with Sony, some of my words, context, and intent were unfortunately lost. Well, here's the long rambling answer for the final question about our future game." What I do find to be interesting there, and certainly whenever I maybe talk to some people in the games industry who do not have as much of a direct, frontline audience relationship as I do, or maybe you're in a business and you're working on product, but then somebody in sales talks to you about the product and they understand it enough to do their job, but they don't get it in the way that you, as the person that, is into product, actually gets it. I think you're going to have a degree of that with Sony PR, who will not understand how much of an awful look all this shit is to the core audience. Maybe PlayStation PR would understand, but certainly not Sony PR. So when you go through it, Druckmann's actual words actually never say the quote, "redefine mainstream perceptions of gaming." That was published, right? But that's actually not what he literally said. Those are not his words. So we can instead talk about his words. He talks about, and now I quote, "new perceptions for gaming," which specifically relates to non-gaming audiences seeing the likes of Fallout or The Last of Us and then becoming maybe interested in games, right? Realizing that games can have those emotionally compelling narratives that they, as people who don't play games, can engage with. Or then maybe after watching the show, they can now engage with the game because they now understand that the game is a universe in where these, mature adult themes, can play out for them to enjoy. And he then ended on a more humble note of thanking collaborators and claiming that he's already worked on his favorite games. So absolutely, some of the bag is on Neil here, yes. But you can see that what he gave there was a far more nuanced and lengthy response. Sony's PR team then reduced it to what went out. And then you have the goofy situation where what is written as a quote from Druckmann ends up not literally being words that came out of his mouth in the way that that quote suggests. And that's where it's interesting because, again, this is Sony PR, not PlayStation PR. And it's why I found this story to be so fascinating, because I saw those headlines and I thought, I mean, I didn't like his last game, and he's rubbed me the wrong way a few times in sort of like interviews and stuff, but I really don't think he's dumb enough to say these things like that. And that's why I think so much of, so many people are like, this is a crazy thing for you to have said. You're supposed to be an industry leader. How could you say something so silly or that is so arrogant and maybe a bit condescending to the rest of the industry? And it turns out it was literally PR person that took his words. Maybe his words are a dough that the PR person then formed into a thing, which you can understand. Because if you're writing for a game industry colleague, you don't want to say something that makes you sound like an arrogant asshole like that. But if you're a PR person who is editing down somebody's, long rambling statement into something that will be lovely for investors to eat up, well, an investor obviously wants to think that the next Naughty Dog game is going to redefine gaming to the whole population of the world. I mean, if you squint, you can almost see how Druckmann's words became the ones that were published. But ultimately, this was not an interview done with a journalist. If a journalist did an interview like that and they twisted and misrepresented things, they would absolutely be being slaughtered, and he would be very well within his rights to complain that a journalist has went and misrepresented him. Here, though, it's more awkward because he is being misrepresented by the PR machine of his corporate overlord. And then he's went and he's sort of corrected the record on one thing, right? He's talked about, appearing to be out of touch and dismissive with teams. So he's talked about that. What he hasn't talked about, though, right, is the stuff that is directly what Sony are trying to sell by doing this interview, which is the investments in AI and that newer generation of technological pipelines. That's the thing that he's not been able to walk back on. And then that raises perhaps the question of what here is real versus what is the corporate work that he cannot push back on. He's evidently been able to push back on the, hey, guys, your edit actually just made me look like an asshole. But he's seemingly not been able to push back the AI stuff, because his first general argument that AI will mean cheaper storytelling and, the mocap stuff, that does not make a huge amount of sense, even compared to like how investors usually will try to sell the AI tech. I mean, similarly, his answer that AI can create nuanced dialogues and characters, like, that's weird. What's going on there? Him dismissing hand animating Jak and Daxter, that comes across as being incredibly short-sighted, because it's funny enough, you go back to those games, because they're hand animated, they still hold up. Even if it's completely believable that a Sony first-party leader would dismiss style for fidelity, I mean, lol, that doesn't jibe with one of his first answers about the tech opening things up, quote, broadening the spectrum from highly stylized visuals to ultra-realistic ones. So there's like gaps and contradictions within what's there, within what ended up going to press, outside of the stuff that he has addressed on Twitter. And I think what's rough about this is that the one thing we can probably rely on Druckmann to actually do is give a detailed example of how the machine learning stuff is working for their proprietary tech to help them do like environmental layouts for maps. Because guess what? He comes from a programming perspective. He's probably going to be able to talk about that, how it might free up creatives and then let them build more things faster with less effort, or maybe get the trudgery out of the way so they can focus on the actual value add things that they're doing, which is the creativity. He could talk about how maybe that will mean the Naughty Dog staff will not be crunched to within an inch of their lives. But the problem is that even down to the words on the page, a lot of this stuff doesn't feel real. It feels weird. It doesn't even feel super connected to the industry, to the art form that he exists within, and that's because it's not meant to be. It is words for investors. AI is the latest buzzword that everyone is talking about, like with Metaverse, like with NFTs, like with even some 3D stuff, some pushing towards photoreal stuff, and then perhaps maybe some indie games actually realize they can't afford to do photoreal. They end up going stylized. Suddenly people think, oh wow, great, stylized, good. You have a game like, say, World of Warcraft that went stylized when, say, EverQuest 2 did not go super stylized. Which one of those has been able to keep its style up to date? So ultimately, until Neil is able to speak like a real person here outside of Sony advertorial, we will likely never know how much of this is his actual opinion or thoughts. Hopefully, if he is in the fence about some of these things, that maybe some of the thoughtful feedback from his industry colleagues would make him rethink some of his assumptions. A little bit like how I can understand what Andy Serkis was getting at when he said that, him turning from a man into a monkey is digital makeup, but for the people who actually are doing the art and the labor of turning him from a man into a monkey, he then comes across as being a bit of a dismissive asshole, which is obviously not something that you want to see or want to think about somebody who otherwise, has an amazing body of work that you deeply respect. It's an interesting situation. Ultimately, where am I left? I am left thinking, man, this was a fun drama. I'm glad that, because look, we could have just went up here and said, Neil, come on, man. Like, I was definitely, when I saw the initial things, I was ready to be like, oh boy, you done it now. But the reality ended up being less simple and more interesting, as it very often does. So that is the crack with today's video. If that is the support, we try to surface things in this way when we can by, doing a little bit more of the research. So if you want to support that sort of thing, obviously Bellular.games is the place to go. With that said, though, well, guess what? There's going to be a video tomorrow, so I'm going to go work on it. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you over there.